The atmosphere above the Blackwood timber claim was no longer composed of breathable oxygen. It had completely mutated into a suffocating, violent campy, churning charcoal and vermis gone copper. The Cromwell fire breached the eastern ridge shortly past midnight, driven by merciless, bone-dry summer gale that trimmed the ancient, towering plimes into her splay much sticks. The being key there was an upside, physical way the prisoned upon the very full, blistering any exposed skin and turning every drawn breath into an agonizing swallow of crushed glass and boiling pine pitch. The deafening freight train roared the approaching funnel drowned out the frantic screams of the dying cam. Beatrice knelt in the blistering, soot-choked dust of the central logging yard, her heavy chest heaving in ragged, agonizing gasps. She was 26 years old. A long dress, his entire existence was spent in those staining, caustic quatrains of harsh lie. She was a woman built with generous, heavy proportions, incredibly soft, wide at the hips, carrying a substantial, undeniable physical weight that drew nothing but cruel, mocking jeers from the rough timbermen whose filthy clothes she scrubbed. She had spent a lifetime folding her broad shoulders inward, constantly pouring the coarse, faded fabric of oversized dresses, trying desperately to minimize the sheer space her large, full-figured body occupied in a world that exclusively valued frail, fragile women. Now, as a towering, 100-foot wall of roaring, orange flames consumed the wooden mess hall just 50 yards away, the very bar felt like an unstable, fatal-lead anchor. Through steam, weeping haze of thick nut smoke, we just watched a fire evacuation wagon lurch fragilely forward. It was during my journey against cowardly overseer, many souls a stained breath a scattered frame. He had explicitly prioritized a heavy iron lockbox of company script over the lives of his workers, climbing his own skinny wife and the camp accountant into the small, overloaded wooden bed. Tethered to the rear iron cleat of the fleeing wagon was a single, unsettled draft mule, its eyes rawing white with primal terror. It was the absolute last chops to escape the burning valley before the fire line completely closed the primary logging road. Beatrice forced her heavy, exhausted legs to move. She scrambled through the raining orange embers, her warm leather boots kicking up thick clouds of hot, gray dust. She reached the back of the moving wagon, her thick, light calloused fingers desperately wrapping around the coarse, bristling hemp rope tying a panicked mule. "Jeopardy!" she screamed, her voice tearing violently through scorched, ash-coated dirt. "Stop, please, I can ride the mule. Help me up." She got the mule's thick, swagging in, attempting to hoist her substantial, heavy frame onto the animal's bare back to save her own life. The wagon ground to a sudden, violent halt in the deep ash. Jebediah spun around from the driver's bash. His face, slick with terrified sweat and black soot, twisted into a mask of pure, vicious malice. He didn't reach a hand down to pull her aboard. He snatched a heavy, iron-tipped walking stick for the wooden floorboards and violently thrust it downward, striking Beatrice squarely in the center of her collarbone. The brutal, sharp impact sent a shockwave of blinding, breathless pain through her chest. Beatrice tumbled backward, heavy by hitting a blistering ash-card that a dull, heavy thud. The physical agony, however, was entirely eclipsed where the instantly shuddering cruelty of the overseer's shriek. Either of the robe, Jabali Ahal, Poile Tringling, accusing finger at her full-figured body sprawled in the dust. "She's too heavy for the horse. You'll snap at spine, you fat cow. We are on dime because he can't push yourself away from table. Let the fire have you." Nahantanaghans. Jebediah stood up and cracked a heavy bowl viciously in the draftee. The wagon body urged fraud, disappeared rapidly into the thick, broad and smoted the only glue trot, completely abandoning the heavy-set long dress to the inferno simply because her physical mass was deemed a fatal inconvenience. Beatrice lay convenient still in the baking dirt. The thunderous rumble of the wagon wheels fade, instantly swallowed by the deafening, apocalyptic roar of the approaching timber fire. The ambient heat was becoming lethal, sinting the frayed edges of her faded cotton dress and turning her dye hair brittle. The profound, crushing weight of a lifetime of mockery finally shattered her unyielding spirit entirely. They were right. She was a hilly, useless monstrosity. Her own body condemned her to burn. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, her tears mixing in the thick black soot around her cheeks, completely surrendering to the terrifying white fire about to cast a tree line. Her likely story, Priestess Grade. Eine stats in spirit einal, solit interior. The vibrating earth beneath her trembling, labyrinth hands suddenly shifted in a rhythm entirely separate from the roaring flames. It was the heavy, deliberate, bone-rattling crunch of massive iron-shod boots stepping directly through the bine, splintered debris. A colossal shadow physically tore through the impenetrable wall of black smoke, eclipsing a terrifying orange glow of the impending fire. Cyrus McCall did not resemble a civilized, northern man. He looked like a jagged, weathered extension of the treacherous, unforgiving mountain peaks towering above them. Standing merely 7 feet tall, as impossibly broad, incredibly thick shoulders strained violently against the scenes of heavy, sweat-soaked canvas duster. He was a solitary, half-felled dragon who resided at the exorbitant, freezing summit of the Devil's Spine. His own mount had bolted in the blinding smoke, trapping in the valley. He'd witnessed the brutal cowardly stench from the edge of the Bine timber. Sarstein cast a single desperate glance down the smoke-choked valley tree. The wolf flings at a ray completely severed. His pale, intense, proudly eyes snapped upward, looking onto the sheer, jagged, vertical cliff face towering directly behind the logging camp. It was a brutal 10-mile vertical ascent of loose, treacherous shale that represented the absolute human escape of the firelight. Then Cyrus looked down. He saw the heavy, weeping one left to burn like discarded refuse. He'd heard a shrieking, cruel weight echoing the flanks. Cyrus didn't waste a single breath on belagging to the ancient, panking campets. He closed the distance in 3 massive, ground-eating strides. He dropped his heavy leather supply pack directly into the hot ash. His massive, severely scarred hands moved with a terrifying, absolute, mechanical efficiency. He ripped open the heavy leather pack, pulling free tangled massive, thick, heavy-duty leather drowned ounces in wide canvas rigging typically is drawing massive, dead-weight game out of deep ravines. Beatrice gasped in pure, unadulterated shock as the towering, sustained giant suddenly loomed completely over her. "Stand up," Silas commanded. His voice was a deep, gravelly, titanic rumble that vibrated forcefully in the sweltering air, offering absolutely no room for debate or hysterics. I can't," Beatrice sobbed, her chest heaving, her thick arms instinctively crossing over her stomach behind her sides to meet another cruel, judging mound. "I'm too heavy," the overseer said. "I'll just kill you both. Leave me. I take up too much space." Cyrus's pale, amber eyes flashed with a sudden, blind, absolute wrath. Wasn't directed at her tease. He'd see monstrous, repulsive burden. He'd your soft, full curves, Hawaii hips, in the undeniable, substantial way her boy, and he saw the ultimate, second and bone turn lithe, warmth, and girthy. Everything the freezing, brutal mountain peaks desperately lacked. A coward blames the iron for being too heavy to forge. Cyrus ground, his massive hands reaching down into the dirt. He didn't wait for her to find her footing. He grabbed her foot, soft forearms, and held her for the ash with a shocking, breathtaking ease, as if her substantial 200-pound flying weighed absolutely nothing to his massive muscles. He spun his broad, heavily muscled back toward her. "Put your arms around my neck. Lock your wrists." Cyrus barked at a deafening roar of the flames. The blistering heat now thick is searing the backs of their necks. "Do let go." Beatrice was entirely paralyzed by the shock of his string, but the sheer, undeniable authority radiating from the giant held her to ray. She wrapped her thick, soft arms tightly around his massive, tree-trunk neck, her tear-soaked cheek hissing against the rough, sweat-stained canvas of his car. Cyrus reached back. He grabbed the heavy leather drat straps. He did not treat her like a fragile, breakable doll, nor he treated her like a cumbersome burden. He treated her a most precious, vital cargo he ever secured in his life. He brought wide, incredibly thick glass straps directly under her full thighs, pressing back over his own massive core chest and bucking tightly with heavy iron clasps. He strapped her substantial, generous body absolutely flush against his broad back, binding her full hips and heavy stomach directly to his spine. "You tear you muscles," Beatrice wept, absolute terror seizing her boots completely left that earth, her entire substantial weight suddenly suspended entirely by the giant's war-feeble strength. "Please, you have to drop me." Silas didn't answer. He gripped the thick leather straps digging violently into his own massive collarbones. The thick veins in his neck immediately corded and bulged under the immense, staggering weight. The war fire unleashed a blinding, incinerating way heat. He instantly ignited the roof of the worn bunkhouse just 10 yards away, showering him in fresh days of going on sparks. Silas McCall leaned forward, burying his bearded chin deep into his chest, and drove his heavy iron-shod boot directly into the steep, jagged, vertical ingoing the mountain trail. He did not run. He began a slow, brutal, impossibly agonizing tectonic march straight up into the suffocating, smoke-choked sky. Every single shot was a violent, muscle-tearing explosion of sheer, inhuman endurance. While the shallow cowards of the valley thrown her into the ash because she took up too much space, the slow-tree fell giant of the peaks bore her entire, magnificent weight against her leading back, beginning a 10-mile vertical ascent through a burning hell to carry her directly into the clouds. The air thinned with every grueling yard of elevation, transforming from a thick, blistering soup of airborne ash into a razor-sharp, freezing current that scraped the back of the throat. The deafening, apocalyptic roar of the timber fire slowly receded beneath them, replaced by the terrifying, rhythmic scrape, scrape of Silas's heavy leather saws slipping and catching against the least, treacherous shale of a vertical cliff trail. Beatrice was acutely, agonizing, conscious of her own mess. Every upward lurch of the giant's massive thighs transferred the violent, dead-weight momentum of her generous curves directly into the thick draft harnesses. She could feel the heavy canvas straps biting mercilessly into the corded muscles of his broad shoulders, pouring thick canvas of his dust toward until she heard the sickening sound of the heavy fabric actively jarring at the impassable strand. Choose a one built with substantial, undeniable force, and in a sheer, punishing gravity of the ascent, she felt like a monstrous, localized crushing force pressing directly against his spine. "Please," Beatrice begged, her voice a fractured, smoke-ruined rasp muffled against the sweat-drenched nape of his thick neck. Her hot tears cut jagged parts through the thick layer of gray soot coating her rounded cheeks. "You tearing her round flesh. I can feel the strap sticking to bones. Drop me in the rocks. You die on this incline carrying on my size." Silas did not pause his agonizing, mechanical stride. He did not turn his head. He simply gritted his teeth, the muscles of his massive bearded jaw locking so tightly they formed a rigid, terrifying knot of pure endurance. He reached one colossal, severely scarred hand backward, his tossed fingers gorging the back of her heavy, ashcan thigh in gesture absolute, unyielding possession. It was not crude touch. It was the iron, grounding grip of a protector anchoring his cargo to the earth. "Hold the leather," Silas ground out, each syllable a brutal, agonizing effort pushed through scorched, heaving lungs. He did not waste breath on reassurances. He simply leaned forward, his massive chin buried into his carbone, and drove his boots deeper into the unstable rock. The miles dragged into hours of pure, unadulterated physical hell. The temperature plummeted drastically as they crowned out, but the sheer, monumental exertion had turned the tracker into a boiling, radiating furnace. Beatrice felt the unnatural, violent heat pulsing from his toned-back muscles. She looked down through the swirling, toxic gray smoke clearing around their ankles and saw the horrific, devastating toll their heavy man was exerting. With every lung burn and stirred, scarce and leaving the stunned, wet, dark crimson footprints on the pale, jagged limestone. His feet were literally bleeding inside his boots. The skin fled by the impossible, sustained friction of holding a 200-pound frame up a near-vertical goat path. The guilt was a vertical, suffocating vice locked tightly round Beatrice's windpipe. Just as the moon crested the jagged horizon, cast a cold, silver light the apocalyptic smoke bloom churning in the valley far below, the finally breached the inversion layer. They stepped out of the suffocating and stood dartless and into the startling, freezing clarity of the high-altitude peaks. The air was incredibly pristine, sharp, and tasted of Asian ice and raw mountain ozone. Emerging from the rocky precipice with a sprawling fortress of profound, forgotten isolation. It was not a crude, temporary timber shack. It was the curdling, majestic stone ruins of the Aishik Spanish mission, built directly into the sheltering, impenetrable overhand of a massive granite cliff face. Thick, heavy, hand-hewn cedar beams supported the surviving slate roof of the main cloister, and the soothing, rhythmic, neutral sound of water echoed through the quiet courtyard from freezing, natural water and spring bubbling directly from the living rock into a deep, moss-lined stone basin. Silas staggered heavily through the crumbling limestone archway. He did not drop her. Even in his athlete, muscle-shredding exhaustion, he was meticulously, heartbreakingly careful. He dropped to his knees on the cool, worn flagstones, his entire massive frame shaking a violent, terrifying roar. He reached out violently trembling, blood-slit hands, his thick fingers fumbling desperately to unbuckle the heavy iron gloss in the draw's tonsils. The thick leather partly gave way. Beatrice slid gently from his RC perk, her skirt breaks hitting the swore store. Before she could even reach out her heavy arms to steady him, the towering, indestructible tracker simply followed. His eyes rolled back in his head, he collapsed face down to the ancient stone till a heavy, deafening thud, his cheek resting thus inches from the baboon spoon. Cedrits, he just groaned on, the son echoing warmly with the shoe-coin walls. She dropped heavily to her knees beside him. The sight of his ruined body completely paralyzed her with a fresh, horrifying wave of self-loathing. The heavy canvas duster was completely shredded across his incredibly broad shoulders. Neath the ruined fabric, the massive, coiled muscles of his upper back were severely, violently torn, weeping dark blood for the sheer, impossible strain bearing her hairy, full-figured weight for 10 fish miles. His breathing was a terrifying, wattling wheeze, his lungs severely scorched by the hours of inhaling superheated black ash. And his boots were completely saturated, leaking dark, pulling crimson onto the pale, ancient stones. She hit Brookingen. The crew logging overseer was right. She was a heavy, monstrous thing that destroyed the spine of whatever tried to carry her. She sat back on her heels, the hot tears entirely blurring her vision, her calloused, lie-burned hands covering her face, preparing to succumb to the helplessness she had been taught to accept her entire life. At the visceral memory of Jebediah's vicious, iron-tipped walking stick striking a collarbone, the memory had been left to bring that while the thin, fragile wind said, Subway flared in her mind like a lit match. Silas had not stuck her. He had bled with her. He had literally torn his own body apart to pull her substature away from the fire. I will not be a helpless, weeping further, Beatrice vowed to the silent, ancient stones, a sudden, fierce spark of absolute, iron will igniting deep within her chest, completely overriding her lifelong, paralyzing shame. He bled to carry my mass. I will use it to heal him. She flessed herself to stand. Her heavy, ash-covered dress was ruined, smelling intensely of stale smoke, sweat, and singed cotton. Beatrice didn't hesitate for a single fraction the second. She reached behind her back and violently ripped the dress away, stripping down to her heavy, white cotton undergarments and thick, voluminous petticoats. The freezing mountain air instantly bit at the soft, substantial, full curves of her arms and heavy breasts, but she ignored the biting chill entirely. She ignored to the deep still bison in the night in spring. grilling wildly in damp, shaded crevices of the grant with thick, fleshy clusters of wild matin agave and thorny yucca. Theaters recognized the resilient plants from her grandmother's old portus remedies. She used her substantial physical strength to grit the thick, spiky leaves, ripping the reiki from their deep, stubborn roots, and gnawing the sharp thorns tearing the soft flesh of their ponds. She carried the heavy clustered leaves to her flat grinding stone near the spring. She found handy, smooth red rock and used to rhythmically remigi pond a tough, fibrous agave until the thick skin split open, releasing a dense, cool, incredibly soothing, viscous sap. She tore the clean layers of her own heavy cotton petticoats into long, wide strips. Gathering the medicinal pulp and the bandages, she returned to the fallen giant. With a raw, undeniable physical power the frail, starving wind simply did not possess, Bantus wished to soothe Fuon's being Silas's massive 280-pound verso. She did not try to lift things with her wrists. She used the sheer, substantial leverage of her own wide hips and heavy thighs to roll him gently onto his side. She unlaced his ruined, blood-soaked boots, pulling the thick leather gently from his messy feet. His soles were horrific, walk-spans of burst blisters, ground in shale and violently torn flesh. She wished the blood in the white hash away with the freezing, hue spring water, his soft, heavy hands moving with an absolute, maternal, breathtaking tenderness. She applied the thick, cooling agave pulp directly to his raw, bleeding feet and the violently torn, bruised muscles of his broad back, binding the deep wounds tightly with the clean strips of her cotton petticoats. She worked tirelessly through the freezing, sullen mountain night, the sweat dripping from her brow, completely unashamed of the sheer space her full-figured body occupied in the sprawling ruins. She moved with steady, relentless practice, her heavy hands proving to the silent stars that they were not a useless burden, but the absolute, undeniable instruments of his salvation. The bruised, violet light of early morning slowly bled over the jagged parapets of the ancient Spanish mission, casting long, fractured shadows across the limestone courtyard. The air at this extreme elevation was brutally thin and carried the biting chill of impending frost, completely untouched by the apocalyptic destruction smoldering 10 miles below in the valley. The unsound disturbing a profound, graveyard stillness of the ruins was the rhythmic, musical cascade of the natural artesian spring overflowing its moss-lined basin, and the harsh, rattling inhales of the wounded man lying on the flagstones. Beatrice remained kneeling beside him, her limbs trembling with a deep, bone-deep exhaustion that threatened to pull her into unconsciousness. She had not slept a single wink. Her knuckles were stained a pale green from clutching the fibrous mountain agave, her breathing shallow in the freezing dawn air. The poultices she had particularly crafted from her shredded petticoats had hardened into stiff casts over the savage, weeping tears traversing Silas's broad back in the flayed, ruined soles of his feet. The bleeding had finally stopped, but the fever of profound physical trauma was just beginning to take hold. Suddenly, the low, guttural vibration rumbled deep within Silas's massive chest. It was not a sigh. It was the raw, primal sound of a man waking to incomprehensible agony. His thick, heavily corded arms twitched violently against the cold stone. He attempted to push his arm away the foe, his survival instincts fighting blindly through the haze of exhaustion. But if he turned his face to the pan, rising sound, a sharp wagoness of pure torment tore through his suit's handpin. He drew his massive, severely blistered hands up to his fence, his thick fingers frantically pawing at his own bra. Beatrice, Silas rasped. His voice was knowing the steady, tat-tat rumble of the fearless tracker. It was a broken, jagged scrape of pure, unadulterated panic. The sight to center of the devil's spring was swiftly Frenching on the stings like a trained animal. Beakers, the white, its boning, I confirmed the light. Beatrice's arm seized her chest. She scrambled void, the rough limestone scraping her bare knees. She grabbed his massy, flaying wrists, utilizing the substantial, grounding weight of her own body to pin John's down, preventing from clawing at his face. I right here. I'm hauling you. Do not rub them. She leaned in, inspecting his face in the brown dawn. The pronged Britos bear to Subaiti Tasha Bergsner der ner agonizing Vuhikosen Zek in a horrifying toll on his vision. His eyelids were grotesquely inflamed, entirely swollen shut and welded together by a thick, weeping crust of blasted tissue and embedded ash. The tracker was completely ash-blind, plunged into a suffocating ink-block void. For men who navigated the lethal precipices of the high mountains were lying entirely in the shallows of his gaze, and sullen darkness with a catastrophic, paralyzing terror. The fire took my eyes. Cyrus breathed, his massive chest heaving with sudden, violent hyperventilation. The invincible giant was trembling beneath her grip. "No," Beatrice replied, her voice dropping to a low, incredibly stay, Mouton registered the instant they anchored the cow to edge the courtyard. The gaunt, how-cheat spectres of high society were shrieved wet in sight and ruined face, appear pursuant a profound, heavy, unshakable fantation. Is the porcelain scent? The tissue is scorched, but it will heal. I will not let he wander in the dark, Cyrus. I'll be the sight you can't he like. She did not wait for his pang to fully subside. She moved with deliberate, heavy purpose. Tearing the flying tea scrap of the white cotton undergarments, she swerved entirely the free hue pea water the welt his will. Watching to his side, she gently draped the icy, soaring cloth directly to his swollen brain eyes. Cyrus gasped sharply at the biting cold, but the violent threshing immediately ceased. The sheer, substantial weight of their soft hands resting gently against his temples provided a physical tether to reality. For the next 72 hours, Beatrice transformed into the absolute, undeniable centaur of biking dunes. She did not utter a single complaint but the grueling, unrelenting physical lean. When the giant needed to be moved into the sheltered, dry alcoves of the main sanctuary, she wedged her thick, soft shoulder directly beneath his massive arm. She utilized her wide hips and substantial, heavy body weight as a literal, physical pillar, racing her thick thighs against the flagstones to keep the 280-pound man from collapsing. Her body did not backward. Her sturdy, ample frame absolved his staggering weight flawlessly. She boiled dried venison strips and wild mountain garlic found in his leather pack, using a rusted iron kettle over the ancient haft to feed him rich, restorative broth. She bathed his face every few hours, carefully wiping away the weeping fluid from his blistered corneas. In the pitch-black void of his ash-blindness, Cyrus began to rely on the soft, heavy sound of her footsteps and the grounding want of her hounds with a desperate, worshipping her lines. On the evening of the third day, a freezing mountain gale battered the thick, impenetrable stone walls of the ruins. Inside the sanctuary, the ancient earth blazed with a roaring pine-wood fire, casting deep, dancing shadows across the vaulted ceiling. Beatrice sat cross-laid stone floor beside his bed, could hide. A dark hair found nicely allied the uncosseted shores. She was gently plowing fresh along the crew and egg gave sap to the dew wallen teas across the hewn walk. Cyrus lay in his stomach, his eyes still banged in clean, damp cloth. The agonizing tension in his torn muscles was slowly beginning to yield them to his heavy hands. He lifted her in the alkali dust. Cyrus wobbled suddenly, his voice entirely shattering the cried crock off the hearth. Beatrice froze, his soft cast fingers hovering inches above his scar shoulder. Who did? Cyrus swallowed hard, his massive chest expanding heavily against the furs. The blindfold hid his damaged eyes. It could not conceal the profound, decades-old agony twisting his beaded jaw. 1849. The Western Crossing. I was 8 years old. The trial was a brutal, starving hell. The creeks dried up to cracked mud, and the dressed oxen who dined in withing oaks. He paused, his massive, heavily calloused hands boiling into tight, trembling fists against the stone floor. My mother, she was boned like you, Beatrice. She was one of ample substance, soft, generous. The wagon master packed when the animals started collapsing. He decreed the wagons were carrying too much weight. He pointed my mother and called her a massive, useless excess. They physically threw hard the wagon to the dirt to spontane feasts. Beatrice stopped breathing, the visual memory of Jebediah's iron-tipped walking stick striking her collarbone, the memory of being left to burn in the dirt while the thin woman was spared, fled violently behind her ribs. I tried to lift her. Silas webbed, a single-out tear escaping from beneath the damp cotton blindfold, cutting a clean track through the soot on his cheek. It was a sound of absolute, devastating heartbreak that completely dismantled the terrifying myth of the feral mountain dweller. I was just a skinny, starving boy. I pulled frantically at her arms. I screamed to the men, but I couldn't move. I watched my mouth fade into the white dust as the wagon train rolled on, leaving to starve in the baking sun simply because she occupied too much space. Beatrice let out a wide, shuddering sob, her hand instantly carving the knife to my boy's arm. I saw an oath to God that day, Silas whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, holy intensity. I swore I'd build my back until it was wide enough to carry the entire world if I had to. I swore that I would never, as long as I possessed breath in my lungs, undo me substance to his guardian in the dirt again. He shifted his massive weight, pushing himself upright until he was kneeling the fears, facing her intense in firelight. He still entirely blind, trapped in the dark, but he reached his messy, scarred, blistered hands out into the empty space between them. Let me map the woman I pulled from the embass, Silas rasped, his thick fingers trembling slightly. Please, do not retreat from me. Beatrice's heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against her stern. She's wearing only thin, white undergarments. She had spent her entire 26 years violently hiding her heavy, full-throated goodbye, drawing oversized, suffocating layers to conceal the soft, triggerous propulsions that the shimmer world finds so repulsive. Every ingrained instinct screamed at her to shrink away, to hide her wide hips and heavy stomach in the shadows of the ruins. But she lit up the blind, weeping trucker who literally tore his own flesh to ribbons to carry her to a burning hell. She did not shrink. She leaned forward, completely clenching the distance, and lined his mixed hands to find her. Silas's touch was not the rife, grasping grope of the crude timberman. It was a touch of absolute, breathtaking, holy reverence. His thick, severely scarred fingers traced her jawline like a scar reading sacred text. His hands moved slowly, respectfully downward, mapping the broad, strong slough of the shoulders, and tracing soft, heavy, abundant swell of her breast into thin cotton. The wrist trembled violently, hard flush rushing entirely over her skin as she held her ground. His massive hands traced the wide, substantial flare at her waist, his palms completely filling with the soft, full, heavy curves of her hips and stomach. He didn't feel a cumbersome, loath excess. He felt the absolute, undeniable, physical manifestation of and he lost in the desert 30 years ago. Sending a violently wonderful shiver straight down her spine. He leaned forward, pressing his bearded forehead directly against the soft, warm swell of her chest. They're blind, hollow, pathetic fools. He wrapped his massive, heavily muscled arms completely round her wide hips, volleying his face into her shoulders with a desperate and severe lines. You are not handing on stressity, dangerous, the giant went, his voice complete with his spare lawn, holding onto her full, magnificent body as if she was a very center of gravity itself. Your century of flesh, carrying a mass with the single greatest honor of my entire miserable life. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. That raw, fractured confession did not simply echo into the vaulted darkness of the century. It entirely dismantled the suffocating cage of shame that had imprisoned Beatrice for over 2 decades. She sank flee into the bed of cured hides, enveloping his massive, trembling shoulders with her thick, soft arms, pointing heavily scarred, blindfolded face deeply into the yielding warmth of her ample cleavage. For the first time in her 26 years, Beatrice did not attain to shrink or fold this off the way. She permitted her substantial, generous body to occupy every single inch of space it required, holding the weeping, feral tracker with a fierce, unapologetic, maternal gravity, physically anchoring his fractured soul to the earth. Over the ensuing week, the apocalyptic inferno in the valley below gradually starred itself against the unyielding, sheer granite walls of the Devil's Spine. The catastrophic fire burned down into a desolate, smoldering ocean of pale gray ash and blackened, skeletal timber. As the dense, toxic particulate finally drifted away from the high-altitude peaks, revealing startling, piercing canopies surrounding blue sky, the horrific information flaying Silas' eyes began to recede. Beatrice had meticulously bathed his smudged face with the fragrant, pure artisan butter every few eyes. When she finally unknotted the damp cotton cloth, Silas did not stare into a pitch-black void. His vision remained severely compromised. The edges of his sight swam in a hazy, watery distortion, and the brilliant, high-altitude sunlight drove vicious, stabbing spikes of pain through his raw, bloodshot corneas. He could only discern vague shapes, shifting shadows, and the stark contrast of light, but the terrifying threat of permanent, absolute darkness had passed. The violently torn, weeping muscles of his broad back were slowly beginning to knit together beneath the thick, stiffened layers of her agave poultices, though every localized movement still pulled a tight, grunting hiss from his thick throat. They had survived the blinding smoke, but the mounting was a brutal, indiscriminate sovereign that demanded constant, waking vigilance. It was a quiet, sweltering Thursday afternoon. Beatrice stood at the edge of the deep limestone basin, the brilliant sun warming the thick, white cotton of her undergarments. She was utilizing a heavy, smooth river cobble to crush dry wild mountain garlic, her full, strong arms moving the rhythmic, unyielding efficiency. Silas saw to the deep, cooling showers of the crumbling stone plasma, the heavy, jagged-edged hunting knife resting across the white knees of her worry, white sensitive eyes scanned an arm, jagged entrance to the ruins. The profound silence of the high peaks was violently severed by the sharp, metallic clack of a lever-action rifle chambering a heavy lead cartridge. The mechanical sound echoed sharply off the sheer granite walls, followed immediately by the desperate, scrambling crunch of heavy leather boots slipping a loose shale. Beatrice froze, the heavy river cobble sliving from her lithe, calloused fingers to the flagstones with a dull, hollow thud. Stumbling through the crumbling, ancient archway of the mission were 4 men. They were completely covered in pale white ash, their clothes scorched into ragged ribbons, their faces hollowed out and desperate for severe, prolonged dehydration. Leading the pack of surviving timber thugs was Jebediah, the corrupt Lucy's rat-like features were twisted into a mask of pure, malicious quaid and parched enchanter. He clutched the heavy iron warpox of thumb in his whip on his farm, and a heavy Winchester repeater in his right hand. They had fled the fire line, the surrounding valley creeks had boiled dry. Dream mat by a relenting thirst and the heavy brin of stone Peru, they scaled the treacherous go-pipe, know the ancient splash ruins of a pinned, free mountain spring. Jebediah's broad-shirt, sunken eyes right immediate hand had teeth within basin crystal caned waiter. And his frantic haste snapped to the one standing beside it. A cruel, ugly, utterly stunned sneer stretched across the overseer's filthy face. "Well, I'll be damned to hell." Jebediah approached, his voice a dry, ruined rusp of peeling rook of coins. "Look what the ashes spat back out. The fat laundress laying. And here I soon we'd find nothing but a puddle rent grease at the bottom of the clave." Beatrice's breath snapped painfully in her throat, a sudden blinding spike of ingrained, lifelong terror flooding her veins at the familiar sound of his mocking, degrading voice. "Cue the cow and secure the waiter." Jebediah sheet his high thugs, dropping heavy leckparks onto stones and raising the Winchester directly toward Beatrice's chest. A foddy overseer's trembling finger could even brush the clogged steel of the trigger, a terrifying, guttural roar, pure, unvarnished, feral wrath erupted from the deep shadows of the cloister. It was a sound that shook the ancient mortar from the ceiling joints. Cyrus did not moints like a wanted, half-blind invad. He spliff in the shadows like a colossal, unstable siege engine of Rome and vengeance. Able to see the iron sights of the revolver with his boy donat's vision, he and mortar drawn to fire on. He shot the wreath into the blinding sunlight, though the mossy, juggy hunting night in this horrifying dance. Shoot the giant! One of the thugs screamed, frantically raising a rusted, soot-choked revolver. Crack! The bullet grazed the heavy, bandaged meat of Cyrus's massive left shoulder, but the giant did not flinch or break his devastating stride. He crashed Derrick into the thugs with the sheer, destructive kinetic force of a falling boulder. The tranquil Kochai instantly devolved into a chaotic, swirling nightmare of visceral, bloody violence. Cyrus drove the heavy bone handle of his hunting knife directly into the jaw of the first thug with a sickening, wet crunch, entirely shattering the man's mandible. The second and third mercenaries tackled the giant simultaneously, driving his staggering frame backward into the shy, freezing water of the spring. The basin violently erupted, instantly swirling a dark, loon cloud of crimson as size fought like a feral grizzly in steel trap. He twisted his massive, coiled forearms to block a desperate knife thrust, his nose hands reaching out and word-ridging, breaking through the fruit and wallingly pointing beneath the freezing surface of the water. Within his feral, half-blind salt-laying basin, Cyrus's healing back was completely exposed. Jebediah had not joined the wet, bloody melee. The cowardly Osier scrambled back when the crustacean flagstones had to leave way in splashing chaos of the spring. He raised the heavy Winchester repeating Raku, stepping naturally until he quietly completely clear, arm stuck he shot directly at Sumptuous's bonely torn, paused spine. Pierced, poised by the edge of the stone basin, she watched the overseer cock the hammer back. She saw the lethal, malicious intent burn in his desperate, rat-like eyes. The suffocating, lifelong terror of being heavy uses it and vashed and tie. It was completely incinerated by blinding, white-hot and furrow, absolutely protective rate. She was not the hapless, fat laundress waiting to be slocked. She was the matriarch of the Macan. She possessed an absolute, undeniable, staggering physical power. Beatrice did not sweat for a small throwing stone with disguised revolver. Her dark eyes looked into a massy, foreign structural timber. A sod, petrified cedar roof beam resting flagstones just inches for scout boots. It was 9 feet long, thick as a man's torso, and weighed over 50 pounds aged wort. A stalwart, frail one with a shattered alum spine merely tempting to ride. Beatrice dropped into a deep, incredibly wide squat. She dug her soft, like calloused hands and tied in the rough, splinter grain the ancient timber. She didn't attempt to lift the uterus with her wrist or arms. She wedged the high beam directly against her thick, propped waist. She blotted her beats frobly against the uneven ancient stones. She treadled a squat, a thiwat, a culation, and the raw, unadulterated physical mass of her heavy, generous body. She drove her heavy, powerful thighs and her wide, substantial hips forcefully upward, leg pressing the tie, staggering dead weight of the sod cedar beam straight off the ground. She didn't just hold. She hoisted the heavy timber perfectly level, resting a mass weight squarely against her wide, sturdy hips. Jebediah centered the iron rifle sights on Cyrus's spine, his finger tightening imperceptibly on the trigger. Beatrice charged. She drove her hay boots forward, screaming fail, primal battle cry that roused the tracker's own roar. The sheer, unstoppable forementing their tuned her pine frame, combined the merciful dense weight of the solid cedar timber, Trink's finger substantially into an absolutely devastating, literal battering ram. Jebediah heard the shrieking bow cry. He triggered his egg sharply, just as the massive, heavy, flat end of the cedar beam entered his peripheral vision. Crack! The impact was catastrophic. Beatrice slammed the flat, heavy end of the solid timber directly into the center of Jebediah's stern. She didn't halt her forward spurn. She utilized her heavy, thick thighs to drive the overseer completely backward, lifting a skinny frame entirely with his boots, and violently pinned him against the unyielding, solid limestone wall of the courtyard. The sound of his ribcage entirely collapsing under the sheer, devastating, crushing force of her momentum was sickeningly loud, echoing sharply over the splashing water. The heavy Winchester rifle flew uselessly from his deadened, nerve-shocked grip, clattering loudly across the flagstones. Jebediah didn't even possess the remaining breath to scream. His bloodshot eyes bulged in absolute, paralyzed shock as the sheer, resplendent physical mass of the woman he had kicked into the ash entirely crushed the life from his failing lungs. He slumped completely following the heavy cedar beam, sliding lifelessly down the ancient stone wall to crumpling to the dirt. Beatrice dropped the massive timber. It hit the flagstones with a deafening, heavy thud. Her chest was heaving with deep, ragged gasps, her thick arms trembling violently from the adrenaline rush, her face flushed a tight, vibrant crimson icy exertion. She stood tall, entirely unashamed of her immense size, her heavy, powerful body reigning supreme over the broken, pathetic coward bleeding at her feet. The violent splashing in the spring ceased entirely. Silas rose slowly from the body water, the remaining thugs floating motionless in basin. His broad chest heaved, the heavy canvas of his pants soaked in freezing water and crimson. He wiped the blurry, watery fluid from his swollen, healing eyes, blinking rapidly against the harsh sunlight. He looked at the discarded, heavy cedar beam. Here to the ruined, lifeless body the overseer crushed against the courtyard wall. And here to Beatrice. She stood triumphantly amidst the ruins of the fight, a heavy white cotton undergarment speckled with blood and dirt, her dark hair wild untamed. She was not shunking. She was not attempting to hide her behind curtains. She met a shocked, blurry gaze with a fierce, resplendent fire blazing in her dark eyes, an unspoken, silent roar of absolute defiance echoing loudly in the sweltering air of the mission. Silas didn't utter a word. He dropped the bloody hunting knife onto the stones, wading out of the freezing spring, and pulled his fierce, powerful, absolute queen directly into his massive, heaving chest. The enveloping embrace of his massive, soaking wet arms was the only physical tether keeping Beatrice from collapsing onto the blood-slicked limestone. The immediate aftermath of the violence left the ancient courtyard trapped in a deafening, ringing silence, broken solely by the erratic, thundering drumbeat of Silas's heart hammering violently against her own chest. The freezing, spring-fed water saturating its heavy campus earth rapidly seeped through the thin fabric of her wet clothing undergarments, but the sudden chill was entirely neutralized by the intense, radiating heat of his exhausted, towering frame. Beatrice bearing her face into the damp, tangled hair at the nape of his thick neck, inhaling the stark, pungent odors of wet wool, expended cordite, and the sharp, metallic tang spilled live. Her wide, lie-careless tines instinctively flattened against the broad expanse of his troubling back, her fingertips carefully avoiding heating, poultice-covered lacerations. She held him with an immovable, unyielding firmness, allowing the mountainous man to physically depend upon her sturdy, robust foundation as the harrowing rush of combat slowly drained from his veins. Slowly, the tracker's ragged, gasping inhalations began to smooth into deep, rhythmic cadence. Silas shifted his weight, gently shredding himself from the comforting harbor of the generous currents. He blinked his swollen, recovering eyes against the stout glare of the afternoon sun, his blood vision scanning the grim tableau scattered across the flagstones. The mercenaries lay entirely motionless in the bubbling basin. Jebediah's ruined, scattered frame remained crumpled in the castle cedar roof being Beatrice had wielded with such devastating, magnificent force. Silas's gaze drifted past the dead overseer and settled directly upon the heavy, iron-bound strongbox thrusting in the dark. He waded out of the shallow water, his heavy leather boots squelching loudly against the dry stones. He knelt beside the discarded chest, his massive, scared fingers gripping the rusted iron latch. With a single, brutal wrench of his thick wrist, the aged metal snapped. He shoved the domed lid backward. The interior of the box gleamed with a sickening golden luster. Stacked in precise, meticulous columns were hundreds of newly minted bullion coins, alongside thick, tightly bound reeks of crisp paper bank notes. It was the entirety of the Oakhaven Lawn Syndicate's operational capital, a staggering, incomprehensible fortune saying Mr. Rao the forgotten Spash mission. Silas did not stare at the wealth with the hungry desperation of a scavenger. His bruised, scarred features hardened into a bleak, agnated mask of grim resolution. He pushed himself upright, his massive shoulders slumping slightly as though me sighted the currency added a vehicle ton to his bust jet. The western descent is completely untouched by the inferno, Cyrus stated, his voice devoid of all resonance, reduced to a hollow, grating rust that echoed painfully off the canyon walls. He refused to look directly at her, staring instead at the pale, sun-bleached stones near her bare feet. There is a narrow, hidden switchback that leads directly to the coastal rail lines. You will not have to traverse the burned valley. Beatrice remained absolutely still, the damp cotton clinging to her full, heavy thighs. A cold knot of dread began to form deep within her atom. Why tell about the western train, Cyrus? Because you hold the keys to a complete different existence now, Beatrice, the giant mutton, gesturing stiffly toward the fallen chest of Syndicate Ghoul. The words seemed to physically wheeze through it. That Kaisi belies to no one now. The man who cleaned to dad. There is enough capital in that iron box to purchase a sprawling, maniculate estate in Portland, Oregon, San Francisco. You can poise staff for dozens. You never have to plunge your hands into boiling vat of caustic lye again. You can drape yourself in a port of velvet, dye on porcelain, and exist in society that would be forced to bow to your affluence. You've been entirely insulated from the cruel mockery of uneducated temperats. Beatrice's dark eyes widened, a tremor of profound disbelief shaking his sturdy frame. She took a slow, deliberate step to him. Are you attempting to dismiss me? I'm attempting to save you. Silas spoke, the sudden, explosive volume as voice startling a flock of mountain sparrows through the canyon rim. He gestured frantically to his own blood-stained, dripping hands, the vicious scars traversing his arms, as in framed, fanged eyes. Look at the reality of this place. I am a broken, half-blind hermit who communicates through violence. I reside in a crumbling ruin surrounded by ice and predators. I am a savage, Beatrice. You can't tether your magnificent, brewing soul to a man who constantly drags a stench of death to your feet. He fondly lifted his gaze, his watery, damned eyes swimming with a sorrow so immense through to wove the Cerulean peaks. You sovereign, he whispered, his massive chest hitching with suppressed agony. Take the bullion, descend the mountain, go find a sophisticated, gentle man who could provide you with a life of soft, unblemished elegance. Ye desire the finest polished world has to offer, not a blood-soaked courtyard. Beatrice stared at the phone strongbox. It represented the ultimate test to it to exhalate luxurious comfort. It is the financial power to silence every cruel voice that have to here. The means to buy respect from a society that had always treated her as an invisible, cumbersome joke. She walked slowly toward the open chest. Cyrus squeezed his eyes shut, his massive jaw clenching as he prepared himself for the inevitable, excruciating pain watching her depart. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that he was committing the ultimate act of selfless devotion by sacrificing his own happiness for her safety. Beatrice reached down. She did not gather the crisp paper notes. She did not load the gold into her satchel. Utilizing the sheer, magnificent strength of a wide, powerful body as sturdy, tree-trunk thighs, she hoisted the entire, lead-heavy iron strongbox directly at the flag sterns. She gathered the immense weight effortlessly, their bare feet pathing silently across the courtyard until she reached the deep, pitch-black subterranean fissure, the very rear of the grotto, where the artisan springs surged violently upward from the unfathomable depths of the mountain's core. Without a flicker of hesitation, Beatrice tipped the iron chest forward. The gold bullion, the bound apron oats cascading to the raging, bottomless subterranean aquifer. The fortune vanished instantly into the churning, icy vault depths, swept away into the lightless bowels of the earth, prominently unfathomable, the unrecoverable. She lit the empty iron box strap, watching it sink into the dark abyss. Silas's eyes snapped open there with splash. His massive frame went entirely rigid, his mouth parting in insolent, saga bewilderment. "What have you done? That was your entirely new lie. That was your ultimate security. Be sprint of Asium, the breed of the sun illuminating her robust, magnificent suit." She did not look like a woman who had just discarded an empire. She looked like a woman who had just conquered one. "My security," the Aegis demanded, her voice ringing out with an unhued crystalline authority that commanded the very wind to cease. She closed the distance between them with heavy, purposeful, majestic strides. "You believe a stacked minted mepa in a icy coastal drawing room provides security? The civilized world you want to send me to is the exact same world that looked at my substantial body and decided I was only fit to be abandoned to a wildfire. I despise women to take up spies. I have no desire to purchase their shallow, hollow respect." She stopped me inches from his towering frame, forcing the giant to look down to blazing, resolute gaze. "I was stacked for the same lance of genuine reverence my entire life," Beatrice stated, her voice trembling with an overwhelming tectonic affection. "And I panic in the pitch-black darkness, guided by a man who could not even see my face. It met my curds as though I groan. I'm not descending this mountain, Silas. I'm climbing." She reached out, her thick, tremblable hands crimping the lapels of his ruined canvas duster, and pulled his massive fawn downward. If knees, weakened by the sheer, staggering force of affection, buckled against the limestone. He collapsed to the courtyard floor, his face coming to rest directly against the soft, yielding, abundant swell of the uncasted adon. "Eyeing our sight when the ash blinds you," Beatrice whispered fiercely, her fingers weaving deeply into damp, dark hair, cradling starred and the salute these matoned to. "And you are the only man worthy of calling no weight. I'm marveling you." The impenetrable, spork fortress Silas had maintained for 3 decades finally completely disintegrated. A raw, guttural sob tore itself from his throat, a sound of such profound, agonizing relief that it seemed to crack the very stone beneath him. He wrapped his massy, heavily corded arms entirely around the back of her wide, substantial thighs, Barine's weeping face into soft, wan, fine like her chemise. He clung tightly to desperate, draining intensity, his broad shoulders shaking violently as the accumulated grief of his entire life was washed away by her unyielding presence. "My anchor," Silas wept, his tears soaking into her garments, his voice muffled against her stomach. "My absolute sanctuary. I am right here," Beatrice murmured, leaning down to press her lips firmly against the crown of its hand. "The fire is extinguished, my lab. We are home." He held her there amidst the ancient ruins, the musical cascade of the mountain springs singing a victory song over the silence of the defeated men. The staggering fortune of the Logan Syndicate lay lost in the subterranean dark. Cyrus McCall knelt for the magnificent, haze-set one had chosen his jagged reality of a gilded cade, and understood that he possessed the only chatted of the mountain. 4 years later, the song of the devil spying over the tapestry of vibrant, thrilling life. The transition of the seasons had painted the high-altitude ridges in brilliant swarfs of emerald pine and blooming, purple mountain heather. The ancient Spanish mission bore no resemblance to a crumbling, forgotten ruin. The limestone ruins had been expertly repointed, the slate roof fully restored and extended to create a sprawling, shaded veranda. Terraced gardens overflowing with cultivated root vegetables and wild medicinal herbs cascaded down the gentle slopes near the courtyard. The oppressive, haunted isolation of the grotto had been entirely supplanted by the rich, comforting aromas of roasting game, dried lavender, and the sweet scent of baking sourdough. Seated about a wide, intricately carved cedar bench beneath the veranda was Silas. His vision had largely recovered, though faint, milky haze remained of the griffery of his amber eyes, a prurient testament to the inferno he had conquered. He was particularly whittling a small, wooden bear cub from a block of soft pine, his massive, scared hands moving with startling delicacy. Waddling unsteadily across the sun-drenched flagstones was a remarkably sturdy, plump 2-year-old girl with thick, dark curls and a booming, joyous laugh, attempting to chase a blue mountain butterfly. The happy oak door of the refurbished sanctuary swung open. Beatrice stepped out into the radiant morning light. She wore a beautifully draped gown of soft, forest green linen, entirely free of restrictive corset, pinching stays. The fabric flowed elegantly over her generous, abounding curves, highlighting the powerful, substantial hips and full breasts she long so tied. She radiated an aura of breathtaking, undeniable health and profound serenity. She moved with the comforting, unhurried grace of a roan who completely owned the ground she worked upon. She approached the seated bench, carrying a steaming ceramic mug of dark, roasted dandelion root tea. She handed them out to Silas, resting her heavy, warm hand affectionately against the quiet muscle of his thick neck. Silas sat to the tea, his gaze lifting to admire the magnificent one standing siding. He reached out his free hand, his thick fingers tracing the soft, familiar grave of raised, enduring, worshipful adoration. He leaned his head against her hip, a deep, rumbling sigh of absolute contentment vibrating in his chest. The sprawling valley below could keep its fragile illusions in its hollow, judgmental society. Here, elevated above the clouds and smoke, Beatrice had finally discovered a domain vast enough to accommodate her immense spirit, a mandling state of magnificent, substantial white with the very gravity keeping his soul tethered to the height,